Hi and welcome to Lighthouse. I'm Jessica Gaitán Johannesson and this is Read, Think, Act, a video series in which we talk about how we can be inspired by the books we read into taking real action in the world. Today we'll be talking to Mya-Rose Craig, who's written this book, We Have a Dream. Mya-Rose is an environmental activist, an ornithologist, and an activist for equality and diversity in the environmental movement. Hi, Mya-Rose. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. Sorry, I sound like this. I'm a bit ill at the moment, but
You've got tea, which
yes,
is good.
I'm hoping it will make it all better by the end of this.
It will do. It's the power of tea. So this book has just been published and it's absolutely beautiful and generous. But I wanted to start by asking you about your own reading. So is there a book that you remember really pushing you into action?
Yeah, it was a few years ago now, but I remember being like 16 and reading Why I Don't Talk to White People About Race for the first time, and it wasn't even necessarily telling me anything I didn't know, but the way it was so explicitly talking about the UK's history in terms of racism, the way it was so explicitly talking about the importance of intersectionality within all our movements, I think that was a message that I really needed to hear at the time. And as someone who, you know, has intersectionality at the core of all my activism, I think that really shaped like the way that I think about things, especially race.
Did it in any way, did you have that at the back of your mind, that kind of feeling empowered and feeling inspired when you wrote your book, when you put your book together?
Like I said, intersectionality is incredibly important to me. And I think that's absolutely where my book, We Have a Dream, came from. So I'm very big on this concept of global climate justice, which is essentially intersectionality within the climate change movement. And for me, what I wanted this book to do was to be, well, empowering the people that read it, pointing out that anyone could become an activist and make the world a better place, but also, I suppose, highlight the importance of intersectionality within the movement and how we do have to bring all these voices together for it to really work and really be sustainable.
And it really comes across in the book as well. And one of the things that I really loved, and which is so generous about it, is that we get to listen to all of your fellow activists' own dreams. And I was wondering, like, when you were asking them about their dreams and sort of getting all of these stories, how much did you recognize of your own dreams in other fellow activists?
Yeah, I mean, I felt so much like kinship with these people, even in terms of just reaching out and hearing all the different experiences of all these young people from around the world who, for a lot of them, it isn't like, you know, being the hero, being the one to save the world. It's essentially children or teenagers who are so scared about their futures that they've been pushed into action. And I think that was one of the threads that really tied people together. But I think actually one of the most difficult things writing the book was putting the dreams, just because, you know, when you ask someone their dream of the future, it isn't a succinct sentence. They have these massive dreams. People want the world to be a better place. And people would talk for up to 10, 20 minutes sometimes to answer that question. And there were amazing answers. So having to cut that down was really painful. But there was just, yeah, so many amazing ideas coming from all these young people. And I think like something I really felt was just, you know, it is really corny, but how young people are the future and how there are all these people out there who just cared so much and had so many amazing ideas on how to fix all these issues.
Well, I think just those wee titles that you use for each chapter, that you get that succinct, almost like a tiny story from each life about what is almost most important to them. That must have been really, really hard to narrow down, I would imagine.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. And in other ways, a lot of these people had, you know, were very single-minded in terms of the cause that they were fighting for. You know, so you talk to them about their life experiences and their projects, and there was so clearly an issue that they felt so strongly about. And I think that was the other great thing about the book, because one thing I really didn't want was lots and lots of people who were just talking about like climate change. I wanted people who, from their own life experiences, had this massive span of issues that they were passionate about and were wanting to fix. And I think that's definitely one of the things that were achieved. But there were lots of people who, you know, because the whole point of the book was platforming and giving people the opportunity to speak who didn't normally get that. And that felt very literal when I was talking to lots of people in the book, because there were a few who clearly had just never had the opportunity to be interviewed, to speak in that way. And I asked them maybe a question and they would just talk for like half an hour, 40 minutes. I was in conversation with some of these people for literally hours over Zoom, and a lot of that, you know, was incredible in terms of the book, but was also brilliant just in terms of them being given a space for me to say, actually, what you're doing is important and your experiences are important. And I think that was really important as well in terms of empowerment.
Do you think it's changed you in some way as well, and what you do in your activism?
Yeah, I do think so, actually. So I feel like...
It might be impossible to know exactly how, actually, because it's so close in time, isn't it?
Yeah, so I only finished writing it like, just over 6 months ago now.
Yeah.
But I think, like, in my personal experience, I'm at quite a weird intersection where I'm an environmental activist, but I'm also, I would say, a race campaigner and a race activist. And so I'm sitting in these two different worlds. And so I've never been, like, specifically in these groups of activists in that way. I have lots of friends who are into these things, but I've never felt like I was in that community. And I think one of the amazing things about writing this book was it felt like I had built myself a community of people all over the world who, deeply cared about these issues, but were also just really excited, as like me, to be able to talk to someone who, cared.
That's wonderful.
It was brilliant.
And
really
I think
brilliant.
it'll do that for people reading it as well, who will be able to see themselves in it and who also feel like there's no group that actually represents me, exactly. You mentioned that, you didn't want it to be just about like general climate change. And I was thinking climate justice is one of those terms that I think has started getting used quite a lot. When you hear the words climate justice, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
It's funny because I think climate justice is such a broad thing, and I think lots of people would define it in completely different ways. But for me, I think it's just pushing for equity within environmental spaces, and you can interpret that as you want, whether that is reparations and very tangible, whether that is pushing for representation and people to be heard equally. I think all of that's really important, but I think for me as well, it also boils down to acknowledging how white and Western centric environmental movements are, despite Indigenous people in the global South being on the front lines of these issues and dealing with them right now. I find it bizarre that we have events like G7 going on, which are, the 7 most important countries in the world or whatever, and they're in talks about what's going to be done about climate change. And I was down there protesting, but the whole time I was just feeling, what decides that these countries, the ones that get to decide the future of this planet, while people are suffering and people are dying, partially because of their history of colonization as well. And so I think for me, I feel like climate justice is acknowledging the past, acknowledging the impact that has on today, but figuring out a way to move forward from that as well, and figuring out how to help as many people as possible.
Just acknowledging that it was never an even playing field, and it isn't. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And a slightly different topic. So You know, you're an ornithologist and have a lot of experience of birding. How has your relationship with birds and the bird world, you think, made you an activist?
But yeah, I think birds have played, and my love of birds has played the biggest part in terms of me getting involved in activism. So my parents and my older sister are bird watchers. I've been taken out into nature since I was a baby, and I've always had a very strong relationship with it. And I think it's really from that love and enjoyment of the outdoors that I started really engaging with environmental issues from quite a young age. I think I was 11 when I started writing about stuff online. I was younger than that when I became aware of all the issues that this planet was dealing with. And in general, I think a lot more people would understand why they should care about issues like biodiversity loss if they had a relationship with the outdoors. I think at the start of lockdown, it was very interesting, the first lockdown, sorry, because I think, you know, when the parks were locked and things like that, a lot of people suddenly realised how important it was for their mental health even to be spending time outdoors. And I hope that continues on after the pandemic, people understanding why they should be outside. But yeah, I think I'm absolutely where I am because of birds, and I still love them, so...
And I think as well, maybe it is, I wonder if it's useful for people to sort of remember that even in people who are climate activists, because I was wondering, do you think that there's a way in which sometimes climate activism can become a bit, especially in this part of the world, and for people who are privileged in different ways, that it can become quite theoretical, that it's like it's far away and it becomes a bit, you know, sciencey. Whereas if you actually come back to the stuff and the see what's happening, then
I think for a lot of people, especially, well, no, within the movement as well, but especially people outside the movement who don't really engage with the concept of climate change, I think it's something that feels very distant and very unreal, which is kind of understandable. You know, for so many people, day-to-day life is about going to work, getting your kids to school, getting food on the table. And a lot of people feel like they don't even have the time to be thinking about an issue that's going to be major in 5-10 years, because it's all about the now. But I think a lot of that comes back to the way that we talk about climate change in the first place, because we are always talking about these very distant deadlines. And when I talk to people from older generations, one of the things I hear a lot is like, people said we were running out of time 20-30 years ago, and we're still doing fine, so clearly it's fine. And you have to sort of talk to them and be like, actually, no, we have passed a tipping point and we are dealing with climate change in this country. So I'm from the southwest where we get a lot of flooding, and I think the way that we talk about flooding is endlessly frustrating for me because it's climate change and it's destroying people's lives. But the way it's reported in the news is always like, oh, look, you know, there's another flood.
It's an isolated event.
It's that time of year again.
Yeah.
And, you know, no one talks about it in terms of climate change. And I think those are the things that could make this issue incredibly real to people. I think also as well, another thing that really frustrates me is when people talk about climate change being like a great social equalizer. Because I really want to emphasize to people that it's absolutely the opposite. That, you know, the people who struggle most in society, the people who have the least money, the least resources, we're always going to be the hardest hit by these issues. The people, you know, the millionaires and the billionaires and, you know, the upper class, they're going to be the ones that don't feel the impact for another few decades probably. And I guess that's where we come back to intersectionality again, because I think people think that environmental issues are very middle class pursuit. But I want to emphasize to people that climate change is a race issue, climate change is a post-colonial issue, climate change is a class issue, and that we can't forget that.
And you've been talking about older generations as well. I mean, it seems to me that there is still such a huge difference in terms of like younger environmental activists just getting intersectionality. Does that make it at all like frustrating to work with older generations of activists? Do we need to do it more between generations at all?
I think one of the amazing things about the climate movement in particular being so youth-led is that I think that this is a generation of intersectional activists. Like, I think it just is. And I would agree. I think that younger people understand this concept of intersectionality in a way that older generations don't. And I think, to be honest, that's just because of what we've been raised on. My generation of feminism is intersectionality, is intersectional, sorry. The term intersectionality, you know, was created before I really got into activism or campaigning. And I think, you know, that does come into play. I think when talking about these things, it's partially about language. You don't have to go up to people and be like, right, we're making this movement intersectional. Because I think when you talk about it conceptually, a lot of people get it straight away. And it's possibly a lot of people who have been very involved in various movements actually understand it conceptually. They just didn't have the word to connect with it. So, you know, I think there are people from older generations who totally get it straight away. And I think people who don't, you know, there's very rarely arguments around it because there is such a push from younger people, which is as it should be.
Absolutely, but you're so right in that language matters, and it's about trying to kind of we kind of do want the same things, but you know. So I've got one final question for you. When things get a bit overwhelming, and when, you know, when activism is hard and it's really hard work, is there a place in the world that gives you strength and that keeps you going?
Yeah, in a way. Or maybe not a place, but a thing, because for me, it actually comes back to bird watching again. Yeah, for me, it comes back to bird watching again. So I think, like, the outdoors is totally an escape for me, and it's a place where I'm not thinking about campaigning or activism or the internet. I'm thinking about birds. And I think that's really important. That's been really important in sustaining me. Because I'm 19 now. I started campaigning really when I was 11. And I've seen so many people come and go over the years, just because I've seen so many people give absolutely everything to the movement because they feel like they have to make a difference, completely burn out, make themselves very ill, and then drop off the face of the earth. You never hear from them again. So I think I've become very aware that it's really important to look after yourself to create a sustainable movement. And I think the exciting thing is that other people have realised that as well. So even just in my local area, one of the climate Youth Strikes for Climate campaigners has set up this amazing project called the Resilience Project that's all about you know, pushing for mental health resilience and looking after yourself as an activist, and I, you know, especially targeting young people. And I think you know, things like that are incredibly important, especially because, you know, you could argue how fair or not it is in the first place that so many teenagers and children are giving up so much of their time and their energy to try and have a future in the first place.
That's a really great point to end it on. Thank you so much, Mya-Rose. This has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.